Tyron Goldschmidt, I actually think his was probably maybe the most interesting of the three interviews on existence because he gave the most insight. You get the best portrait of the person there. Whereas, uh, I'll give you an example. Someone that I wanted to interview in one of a later trilogy, I linked to the John Shelby Spong interview, and this guy was like, "Boy, that Spong is an asshole. How arrogant that he thinks that his is the only way." And I was like, "Jesus Christ!" I mean, he's passionate and whatnot, but the one thing he's very open. But it shows how people were put off by his sort of stick to itiveness. I actually think the best of those three existence trilogies is the Tyron Goldschmidt one because he has some interesting things to say, but you get the most person from him. Uh, I said before, you have to judge interviews not only on what the subject is, but how much of the person comes through. So there's the two things competing at once. Uh, you may think that
I
Adam Frank.
suppose you could judge it on two different levels. I think the most memorable quotations and ideas come from the Spong one. The one with Tyron Goldschmidt is probably the broadest and gets into his core character. And I think that Adam Frank is probably the most concise in his answers.
Yeah, it's the shortest one.
So they all have their strengths and all have their arguments that you get. The Existence trilogy period is probably the best of all the interview things if you combine them as one.
Yeah. And then go ahead, ask me then what do you want to talk about the poetry translation one next?
The poetry translation one only in the sense this is a tangent from the actual interview itself, but I wanted to ask you something about poetry translation.
Yeah.
How damning do you think it is? Have you read any of the really great poets like Renmer Rilke where their poetry is completely ruined? I know there's Robert Bly,
Galway Canal.
But sorry,
Galway Canal is another guy who fucked it up. M.D. Herder Norton back in the early 20th century was a terrible Rilke translator.
Is it advisable then to get all sorts of poetry translators for foreign poets simply because you might get gems even in the bad translations? But
no, there's no poetry translation that Bly or Cannell did that was even a good poem. Bad translators are bad translators. They don't. It's not like you can have a mediocre poet that pulls something out of his ass. If translators are either high quality or not, there's really very little in between. At least in what I've experienced, I think I mentioned in this poetry translation show, I have 4 or 5 books of Pasternak's translation. All but one is garbage. You wouldn't know that Pasternak was even a good poet. But the one that is a great translation, he's a great poet.
It's difficult to discern in some ways how great a foreign poet is simply because of the translations and the variance in them. Because some get it directly and the language doesn't translate well to English, and instead of getting the essence of what it is, Mitchell and Snow as poetry translators, they will take the essence of what the poem does and they'll change the enjambment, they'll change some word choices that Rilke did, but they get to the essence of what Rilke was conveying better.
Yeah.